I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Russia launches a combined missile and drone attack against Kremenchuk, right in the centre of Ukraine, we consider an intelligence operation in the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which caused $5 million worth of damage. Then we hear about a new play that's just opened in London about Ukraine's war experience, after a deep dive into how Moscow hired African farmers to make shampoo before sending them to war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 16th of June, 3 years and 113 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our Africa correspondent, Ben Farmer. Later, you'll hear interviews Adley Pojman-Ponte did with the team behind The Reckoning, a play based on an archive of witness testimonies. But first, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Let's start inside Ukraine. Let's go back a couple of days. It was a busy weekend of airstrikes inside Ukraine over the weekend. So overnight, Saturday, Sunday, Russia fired 2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles from Astrakhan Oblast in Russia. It borders Kazakhstan, basically, just north of the Caspian Sea. They also fired 1 Iskander-M or KN-23 ballistic missile, KN-23 being the North Korean variant. That came from Kursk Oblast. 4 Iskander-K cruise missiles from Rostov to the east of the Sea of Azov. 4 Caliber cruise missiles also from the Black Sea region. Most of those were shot down, but some did get through. Also, of the 183 drones fired, 159 were either shot down or brought down by electronic warfare, though they were fired from Russian regions all around Ukraine. Earlier on Saturday, Russia had targeted the city of Kremenchuk in Poltava Oblast, right in the centre of Ukraine, targeted with a combined missile and drone attack, damaging energy and agricultural facilities there. That strike said to have involved nearly 200 drones and missiles, including both cruise and ballistic types. That attack came very shortly after a phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Obviously had no effect. Maybe Trump had finally decided whether Putin was, quote, tapping him along, you'll remember. This is 2 weeks after Donald Trump said he needed 2 weeks, in fact, to decide whether or not Putin was serious about peace negotiations or just tapping him along. Now, you got to wonder what these phone calls are for if just hours later more civilian infrastructure is hit. You got to wonder if Donny's lost the art of the deal. Anyway, in his nightly address on Saturday, President Zelensky said, quote, "This is Russia's spit in the face of everything the international community is trying to do to stop this war." It happened right after Putin's conversation with Trump, after the Americans asked us not to strike Russian energy facilities. At the same time as Putin tries to portray himself as a mediator for the Middle East, the level of cynicism is staggering. And then last night, bringing us up to date on Monday, a further 138 drones were fired, killing 6 and injuring many more across Ukraine. Now, this morning, after drones injured civilians in Ryzhenivka Gardens, that's a private neighbourhood in the Dniprovsky district of Kyiv, that's to the east of the city centre. Timur Tachenko, who's the head of the Kyiv city military administration, said on Telegram, the Russians lie about everything. When they claim to have hit military targets, they are actually targeting our homes and our people. This is a deliberate tactic of terror. On the ground over the weekend, again, almost no movement, the same as last week. What movement there was in the Donbass, so that area southwest of Pokrovsk, which was under extreme pressure last week. Russia is still pressing there, trying to get up towards and across the oblast into Dnipropetrovsk. That effort was probably accounted for the majority of the 1,200 Russian casualties we think were taken in the last 24 hours. Now, elsewhere, the Ukrainian Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War said yesterday that Russia had returned another 1,200 bodies of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. This is a fallout from the June the 2nd Ukrainian-Russian talks in Istanbul. More exchanges are expected this week, President Zelensky said on Saturday. Outside of Ukraine, and an operation in the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad on Saturday by the Military Intelligence Department, the HUR, is said to have sabotaged an electrical substation, causing $5 million worth of damage and cutting electricity to a military production site nearby. This is a source in HUR, that's Ukraine's military intelligence, as I said, under General Kirill Bogdanov, a source speaking to the Kyiv Independent. Now, just to dial us back in, Kaliningrad is that Russian enclave. It's got Poland to the south, Lithuania to the east and north, and the Baltic Sea to the west. It's the place US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth couldn't name when asked about the threat from Russia in congressional hearings last week. He also didn't know about the Suwalki Gap. That's the 50-kilometre bit of Polish land that borders Lithuania and separates Kaliningrad from Belarus. It's a bit niche, I will grant you, but it's one of the global hotspots you really should know about if you are US Defense Secretary. Anyway, Mr. Hegseth dismissed the questions from Congressman Eugene Vindman as a quiz. It was all very nice and chuckly from the Defence Secretary, ho, ho, ho. It was all very funny, especially when he tried to divert attention by taking potshots at NATO allies, saying they never did anything in Afghanistan, and that the term ISAF, which you'll remember was the International Security Assistance Force, the name we all went by over there, Mr. Hegseth said that more accurately stood for I saw Americans fighting. Ho, 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 Mr. Hegseth. Just the sort of statesman-like behaviour we expect from someone holding your office, and not at all offensive to those of us who lost friends over there. Anyway, back to Kaliningrad, and in the early hours of Saturday, Ukrainian HUR operators are said to have drained the coolant from this electricity substation's power transformer before setting the whole place on fire. This is said to have caused major damage to the facility, caused that power cut, as I say, impacting nearby Russian military sites. The HUR source speaking to the Kyiv Independent said, "We once again remind you that Russia no longer has a rear either in the east, in the west or anywhere else on the planet. Everything Russia involved in the war against Ukraine will burn, sink and be destroyed regardless of its level of protection or location." We'll come back to Kaliningrad shortly, but that comment about there being no rear area, i.e. no safe area, is interesting, given the admittedly unverified footage from the weekend purporting to show fighters in Mali attacking Russian troops, the Afrika Korps, the band formerly known as Wagner, with FPV drones. I wonder where they got the expertise to mount such operations. But sticking with the HUR, they've said in a statement this morning that an uninsured Russian Aframax-class tanker has been illegally conducting ship-to-ship oil transfers in international waters near Greece and Cyprus since July last year. The HUR says that the use of the shadow fleet and these transfer activities, quote, pose an environmental threat, allow the aggressor to conceal the origin of oil, evade international control and ensure its supply to third countries in circumvention of sanctions. The Kyiv Independent says Ukraine has identified the tanker as IMO 9247443. I had a quick look today. It's all a bit confusing. It seems to have had quite a few names over the years and seems to have been flagged both in Gambia and possibly also Panama. But if anyone else knows how to track ships, then do please have a look at that and let us know what you think. So anyway, back to Kaliningrad, and one of Russia's suspected nuclear weapons storage sites there is said to have undergone significant reconstruction of late. Satellite images reveal that Russia has expanded and modernised at least 5 nuclear-related facilities near European borders in recent years. This is Swedish broadcaster SVT reporting this morning, citing new imagery obtained from Planet Labs. Very interesting story in the Kyiv Independent. Have a look at that. The images were taken in May, this year, so just last month, showing new perimeter protection, new buildings, advanced communications equipment being shoved in there. Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski, he's gone on record in the past as saying that up to 100 tactical nuclear weapons might be stored at the site. And just one final one, Francis. I pointed towards yesterday's British Ministry of Defence daily intelligence update, the tweet from Defence Intelligence. It says that North Korea has lost 6,000 casualties, over half the assessed 11,000 troops they sent to fight for Russia in Kursk Oblast since the deployment late last year. They point to open source reports saying that North Korea has limited the numbers of additional troops for Russia, despite Sergei Shoigu, remember him? Sergei Shoigu visiting North Korea on June the 4th. One of the purposes of his trips was thought to be to ask Kim Jong-un for more troops to fight for and in Russia. But over half the North Korean forces seems to have been killed, wounded, prisoner or missing, but basically a casualty. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. On Friday, we were reflecting on the ramifications for Ukraine of the crisis in the Middle East, a situation which continues to intensify. A US aircraft carrier is leaving the South China Sea as we speak, heading west after a weekend of extensive bombardments by both Israel and Iran and frantic diplomacy between allies of both sides. Perhaps the most significant development with regards to the latter was that phone call Dom referenced, which took place between Presidents Trump and Putin on Saturday, summarised by Trump as follows. President Putin called this morning to very nicely wish me a happy birthday, but to more importantly talk about Iran, a country he knows very well. We talked at length. Much less time was spent talking about Russia-Ukraine, but that will be for next week. He is doing the planned prisoner swaps. Large numbers of prisoners are being exchanged immediately from both sides. The call lasted approximately 1 hour. He feels, as I do, this war in Israel-Iran should end, to which I explained his war should also end. This has sparked speculation. Putin is seeking to use his political influence over the Middle East as leverage in his conversations with the United States. Shortly afterwards, asked if he saw Putin as a potential mediator, Trump said, "Yeah, I'd be open to it. He's ready. He called me about it. We had a long talk about it. We talked about this more than his situation. This is something I believe is going to get resolved." Yesterday, Trump posted he believed Iran and Israel should make a deal to make the Middle East great again, further underscoring that transactional nature of his political philosophy, one that puts him firmly at odds with those in the Republican fraternity who believe now is the moment to destroy Iran's nuclear program, which many argue would require US air support. Now, on that subject, within 48 hours of its operation against Iran, Israel seemingly gained air superiority over the western part of the country, including Tehran. Israeli warplanes began dropping bombs from within Iranian skies instead of relying on expensive long-range missiles. Now, that, of course, is a feat the Russian Air Force has been unable to achieve in Ukraine. And given the fact that even just European NATO powers would likely have air superiority over Russia were the worst to happen, one expert who wrote in argues this is reason enough to take a more risk-tolerant approach to donating ground equipment to Ukraine. Now, the jury is still out on what ramifications, if any, this will have, this escalation, on Russian drone procurement. There are some reports that an Iranian drone production facility was hit over the weekend, but many experts are sceptical both of the reports and of the likelihood it would have much impact on the Ukrainian theatre, especially since Iran only produces engines for the drones rather than all of the parts still in Iran. More tangible consequences are that, in all likelihood, weapons intended for Ukraine will go to US forces in the Middle East, and that the impact on the oil price may bolster the Russian economy. Now, on that subject, and moving more specifically onto Ukraine, Ukraine has received another €1 billion in macro-financial assistance from the EU as part of a G7 loan. Dennis Schmeichel announced that after our broadcast on Friday. He said the funds will be directed toward key expenditures of the state budget. He thanked Ukraine's partners for their consistent and reliable support and said, "Together, we will make Russia pay for all the damage caused to Ukraine." Now, President Zelensky also appointed a new head of Ukraine's mission to NATO, replacing Natalia Halibarenko with Aliona Hitmanchuk. She said her appointment came at a critical time for the future of Ukraine, for the future of NATO itself, and of course for Ukraine's future in NATO. I realise the responsibility. Hitmanchuk is a leading Ukrainian foreign policy expert with a background in journalism, and she's the founder and director of the New Europe Centre, as well as being a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. There's also been a rare update on the subject of kidnapped Ukrainian children, with Ukraine's Centre for Countering Disinformation reporting Russia has transferred 50 children from the occupied Antrasyst district of Luhansk Oblast to a so-called rehabilitation camp in Kalmykia, about 1,170 kilometres by air from Moscow. According to the centre, while the self-described forest fairy tale camp is officially described as hosting sports and creative activities, in fact it functions as a site of round-the-clock ideological brainwashing, systemic Russification, and an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity. The centre says these camps have become instruments of assimilation where Ukrainian children are taught distorted history, exposed to Russian propaganda and conditioned to show loyalty to the Putin regime. War and hostility are normalised, with children being groomed as human resources for future conflicts. Now, we will link in the show notes to that story. But to end, two interesting pieces on Russia's approach to unconventional warfare. The first is a story from the Swiss Secret Service from earlier this month. An investigation by SRF found that employees of Switzerland's Federal Intelligence Service were cooperating with Russian contacts for years before the full-scale invasion, with what they called highly sensitive data apparently flowing out and ending up with Russian intelligence services. The affair centres on the FIS cyber team and a collaboration with the controversial software company Kaspersky. Research by SRF Investigative shows that when friendly intelligence services threatened to end cooperation with Switzerland as a consequence of this, the intelligence service reacted. And it's an interesting read relevant to those interested in cyber and Switzerland's geopolitical role before the invasion. The other is a fascinating long read by Reuters into how Russia recruited a Canadian teenager for their own purposes, resorting more broadly to using untrained spies after its diplomats and operatives were expelled from Europe in response to the invasion. To quote Reuters, "To plug the hole in their operations, Russian intelligence services have shifted to recruiting common criminals or individuals with little spycraft experience. Two European security experts said teenagers are recruited because they're vulnerable, low cost, and often in need of money." Reuters reviewed more than 1,400 pages of Polish court documents in Pawlan's case, which includes all of the messages between this Canadian teen and his SFB handler, more than 300 in total. The messages, as well as Pawlan's testimony to prosecutors, provide a rare, unfiltered view of the sometimes haphazard nature of such operations, where the FSB is using a mixture of threats and lukewarm incentives. Now, in essence, this teenager, who seemed to hold some pro-Russian sentiments, travelled to Russia and was grilled by a group of at least 6 FSB officers and one man who said he was from Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. After several days, they gave him instructions. And after returning to Europe, he was to lose his passport to conceal his trip to Russia and begin working for Russia's security services. This work was to consist of travelling around Europe and taking photos. In Ukraine, on the other hand, I was to enlist in the Ukrainian army and was to receive detailed instructions for this later, after arriving in Ukraine, Pawlan told Polish prosecutors. Bear in mind, the teen did not speak Russian, Ukrainian or Polish. He's now in prison in Poland, and the piece offers detailed transcripts of the correspondence between him and his handlers, a rare insight into that world. But what it really underscores, tallying with the Telegraph's own reporting on this subject, and you'll remember we did extensive interviews with Hayley Dixon on this, is how Russian espionage has seemingly changed as a consequence of Western counter-espionage efforts after the war, and particularly this recruitment of individuals who, as the piece says, are not particularly well seasoned, to put it mildly, in espionage world, or indeed are just criminals. And that's, of course, what we saw with the operations taking place in Great Britain, which were exposed last year. So that's where we are with the key political updates. But just staying on the subject of Russian recruitment efforts, we're very pleased to welcome to the podcast Ben Farmer, Africa correspondent for The Telegraph, to look into a shocking story of how Russia hired African farmers to make shampoo, then sent them to war. Ben, welcome. Where do you want to start in summarising this pretty extraordinary story?
Hello, Francis, and hello, Dom. Well, it's a story I've wanted to do for a long time. We've had glimpses of all sorts of people turning up on the Russian side, glimpses of Indians, Pakistanis, Africans, since really the very beginning of the conflict. So I wanted to have a look, particularly at Africans, how they end up fighting for the Russian side, and what that tells us about the sort of recruitment practices that are going on.
So when you were working on this story, how did you start, as it were? And once you pulled the thread, what did you discover?
So our main sources of information, we were able to get some debriefing reports from intelligence sources in Ukraine where they had debriefed Africans they had captured on the battlefield. And so that was a treasure trove of information about how they got there. And the other thing we looked at was social media channels in Africa, which have a lot of information, a lot of stories from people who have gone from Africa to fight for Russia and what's happened to them. And also, quite poignantly, a lot of posts from families who are looking for relatives who have gone and who have subsequently gone missing and never returned. So I think that I'll go through some of the stories that we found out. So one of them, which we got from Ukrainian intelligence sources, a debriefing of a prisoner called Jean Anona, and he had come from Cameroon, 36-year-old father of 3. And this is the story you mentioned. Now, he was unemployed living in Cameroon, in the capital, Yaoundé, and he saw an advert to go and work in a shampoo factory in Russia. Now, perhaps he was a little bit naive, but he was certainly desperate for money. And he saved up for the ticket and he flew to Russia. Now, almost as soon as he arrived, he was detained. And he was detained with other Africans, including people from Cameroon, Zimbabwe, and Ghana, and Asians from Bangladesh. Now, as soon as he arrived, he was told he wouldn't be working in a factory. He would, in fact, be joining the army. And he was taken and trained in Rostov and Luhansk. And he was given about a month's training. And then he was taken straight to the front. And his military career was over almost as soon as it began. He and some other recruits were told to occupy a bunker. And this was only about mid-May, so only about a month ago. They proceeded on foot to occupy this position. It was immediately shelled. He was the only survivor. He lay in the debris for several days before he recovered the strength to make it out of the bunker. He wandered around for some hours before he was captured by Ukrainian forces. And then he told them what had happened to him. So really, his account on face value appears to be an incredibly cynical attempt to lure Africans. And Jean Anana was only a farmer, as you said. He may have been desperate for money, but a very cynical attempt to lure him into the front line.
And how many cases of this have the Ukrainians discovered? I mean, are we talking dozens, hundreds, thousands?
So we do not have a definitive figure. We think probably at least hundreds, we would say. We came across other case studies, but I think one of the most powerful things for numbers is that in Cameroon, the Central African country, the armed forces have recently issued stricter restrictions on how members of the armed forces can actually leave the country. And they've done that because of the concern that a significant number of people are deserting from the Cameroonian armed forces and are going to Russia to earn the money. We spoke to a think tank which has studied this matter. Now, a Cameroonian private in the army earns about £70 a month. The Russians are offering about £1,500 a month. Now, we don't know the exact number, but it is enough for the Cameroonians to be worried about this and to have taken steps to try and stop Cameroonian members of the military leaving the country. We don't think they're all going to fight for Russia. For example, we also think that a lot of them are going to the Gulf, but they are definitely concerned about the impact that the Ukraine war is having on retention in their military.
Hello, Ben. Dom here. Delighted to speak to you again. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. And you talked there about the pull factor of Russia. But this chap that your article centres on thought he was going for work, to go and work in a shampoo factory. So my first question, and these are both about Russia's information campaign across Africa. So the first question here is, how overt is Russia on the military recruitment side, making an appeal to individuals, say, come and join us for this amount of money? They probably don't mention war in Ukraine, but how much of it is business and shampoo, and how much do they actually say, come and join the military?
We think it is a mixture. So we think the motivation of the people who were going there, some of it was naivety, some of it was desperation for money, some of them we think knew what they were doing. We haven't actually managed to find any overt advertisements, if you like. We think most of the overt advertising has been financial and for work, but we think that there are networks of people, and we think a lot of that networking is, for example, to use a Cameroonian example, through people who've already gone, or people who may have experience calling back home and getting their friends to come. We think there is some of that, and we think that that is being encouraged by the Russians.
Thanks. And just one more on the information campaign more broadly. Now, last week when Israel unleashed day 4 of the current attack on Iran, the Russian Foreign Ministry came out with this extraordinary statement saying they condemned the unprovoked aggression by Israel and said it flew in the face of the UN Charter and international humanitarian law, which caused a lot of wry smirks from those people who have been paying attention. But they're not aiming those comments at us. They're aiming them at the others around the world who perhaps aren't watching things so closely. So what do you see in terms of Russia's information effort and just the sort of diplomatic effort, the soft power effort, if you like, across Africa? What are you seeing and how effective is it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. We're seeing a very, very strong, very determined, very concerted information effort by Russia in Africa. And I think that more than anything, more than specifically having gains, for example, recruitment, I think it is to undermine the image of the West, undermine the image of America, Britain, France particularly, and to get to sow the seeds of a feeling that there is no moral high ground that the West stands upon. They're all as bad as each other, and therefore I think that they feel strengthens their own position by virtue of weakening the standing of Britain, America, France, and so on. That is a very concerted effort. The other thing they're doing is building up, for example, the juntas we're seeing in the Sahel, an enormous effort to bolster some of those through information operations. I wrote last month about the efforts to boost the military strongman in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore. Now extraordinary information efforts to burnish his image as a sort of African revolutionary leader. To the extent, some of it quite sophisticated, we've seen deep AI videos of purporting to show people like Beyonce singing his praises.
Extraordinary. And Ben, if I may, just one final question. The Wagner Group, of course, has been reflected upon a lot in the context of the war. And after it was effectively disbanded in the Ukraine context, it moved to Mali, we understand. And I wonder if you could comment just generally on Wagner's involvement in Africa. Apparently, it's also disbanding there, but interested in your reflections on that.
Yes, Wagner and Russian mercenaries in a wider sense are very much here in Africa, particularly in those Central African junta regimes. But I think what's interesting is that they aren't having as much success as they would make out. They are very much struggling in those areas. They are trying to help defeat jihadist insurgencies in Mali and Burkina Faso in Niger, and that was very much their pitch to those countries. But they're not doing well. Those countries are having a terrible time, and if anything, they are losing ground to those insurgencies, despite the Russian efforts.
Thank you, Ben. We'll link to that fascinating read in the show notes. But now over to Adley, who went to the Arcola Theatre in London last week to watch a new play, The Reckoning, about the war and the trust between those who uncover the truth and those who live with it. Afterwards, she interviewed Josephine Burton, its co-author and director, and Simeon Kylsyi, one of the actors. Olia Hercules, who you heard on Friday's episode, was also an advisor to the production. This is their conversation.
So the Russians left Stoyanka and let you live?
They taste like the real thing. My neighbor grows them. Grew them.
They would have arrested you even for that photo. So you deleted it?
Ну так, конечно.
Yes.
Видалила. А що робити?
What else could you have done?
Важко, Василь Леонідович, пособія тероризму, згідно законодавства Російської Федерації, ви затримані, заарештовані.
I went there to look for some water. And when I got there, I ran into Russians. Then he came out with his hands up. I said again, don't shoot. I'm a civilian, don't shoot. He started to approach me. I took the knife here, like this, and saw this image in front of me.
Josephine, hi. We're here at the Arcola Theatre. I've just watched your play, The Reckoning. You are the co-writer and the director. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how this whole project came about?
So I run an arts organisation based in London called Dash Arts. I am the artistic director, and we create artistic projects with international artists. Our kind of mission is to challenge the way we see the world. So we go on these deep dives into understanding a particular theme or a topic and exploring it with artists, with actors, with participants, with audiences, and with academics to kind of bring together lived experience and expertise to make new performances. And I've been working with artists from Ukraine since about 2014. And just about 2.5 years ago, Peter Pomerantsev and Janine Djavani turned around to me and said, we have this archive of nearly 600 testimonies gathered by Natalia Kremenchuk and other journalists in Ukraine, documenting the experiences and the stories from survivors of the war in Ukraine in order to hold the Russians accountable in the courts of law. And they said to me, we really want to also make them accountable in the court of public opinion. Would you be interested in making a piece of theatre? So I sort of thought, of course, it feels really important. Turned to Anastasia Kosedy, who's a Ukrainian playwright, now living in Berlin, from Lviv, and said, would you like to do this project with me? So she and I then read the testimonies. She read them in the original language, I read them in English, until we found, searching for stories that we thought would be stage-worthy, that would help us to bring to life and bring to stage the stories of the survivors of the war, with a cast of British and Ukrainian actors. So some of the text is in Ukrainian with translation and some of it is in English. Most of it is based verbatim on what the survivors said in their transcripts. But there's also some fictional elements in the play and also, very importantly, some personal testimonies from our Ukrainian actors.
Of all the hundreds of testimonies that you've read, what makes a testimony stage-worthy, as you said?
The main super story for our show tonight is the story of a security guard who was working just outside Kyiv in Stoyanka, in a suburb, and was working in an estate on the 24th of February and was held hostage by the Russians for 3 days and then stranded in a no man's land for a further 10. And I read that testimony and I just felt like there was something around the way that he described not just being held hostage, but then what happened subsequently when he was abandoned in what he called the grey zone. And he walked around these shelled, destroyed landscapes, and he found people and he rescued people and he buried bodies and he just tried to save people's lives. And I read the testimony and I thought, wow, it reads like a film script. So I thought very quickly, this has to be staged. I was trying to find something that was dramatically compelling, and he's an extraordinary natural storyteller. There's a sort of interesting theatrical answer to it as well, which is that Anastasia is more experienced than me as a verbatim playwright, taking real lived testimony and experience and staging it quite raw. And she's currently based in Germany. And in Germany, they're very used to the sort of theatre that is slightly alienating for the audiences and reminding us that we're watching actors, not real people. And in British theatre, we love to completely believe in our characters and completely immerse ourselves in their world. And so it was so interesting for Anastasia and I to be collaborating as co-writers because we come from such different theatrical traditions. And so I suppose we needed to do both with this show. And these are really raw, these stories. I mean, they only happened just a few years ago. And for some, it's still ongoing, these issues that they are describing. And so we needed to honour that. And then I also wanted to create a story that would grab our audiences and completely immerse them in it and make people root for the characters and identify with them. So I think that's what we tried to do, to find those stories.
And so in the show, you've got two British actors, one who plays the security guard you just mentioned, another one who plays a journalist, and then you've got two Ukrainian actors who you said brought some of their personal elements, their personal stories, obviously say the verbatim of the testimonies in the original language. What was the collaboration with them in integrating their own stories, personal lived experience of the war, but also their expertise on their country?
That came almost last, interestingly, in the process. I think the first step was knowing we wanted to tell this super story with our security guard. And then I couldn't quite let some of those other transcripts that I had read alone. I was holding on to there's a story of a mother who escaped with her children in a car. There's a story of a dentist who continued to look after patients and Russians in an occupied part of Ukraine for 284 days or something. There's a story of a priest who had this very dramatic evacuation, and there's the story of a volunteer at the railway station in Kramatorsk. And I couldn't leave those stories alone. They just felt so powerful and also had some resonance with the main story. So we knew that we needed those. And then I really wanted to bring in Ukrainian actors to tell those stories, to hear the Ukrainian. And so I created this fictional idea that these are the previous interviews that the journalist has conducted that, like me, she can't forget. And so we encounter those other interviews through her memory, and she's translating them into English, but not straight simultaneous translation. She's absorbing it and using the second person. So she's saying, oh, you went down the street.
That's what we do in interviews as well. It's an interviewing technique of just verifying that you've understood and also showing care and empathy by restating what you've just heard.
That's exactly it. It's another form of translation. So I thought that would be a really interesting way to hear the Ukrainian with translation. And then I think the last thing to come back to your question, was that it just felt so essential that our Ukrainian actors owned their story. And so that became the kind of missing link, really, was that the Ukrainians were the framing device. So they opened the show, they break the fourth wall, they talk to our audiences, they welcome them, they tell them who they are, they tell them their family story. And then at the end, very significantly, they give them salad.
So tell me more about the salad, because the salad was absolutely delicious, and it's quite striking that we get to experience some of the food that is being made during the play.
Yeah. Well, so the way that I tend to talk about it these days is that I say some of these stories that we hear on stage aren't very palatable. And so I needed to offset some of that with something tasty. And I worked with the Ukrainian chef Olia Hercules, who is a great friend and collaborator of Dash Arts, and asked her if she could help me integrate food into the show. And so our protagonist, our security guard, is making a salad all the way through the show. He's chopping tomatoes and radishes and cucumbers and spring onion and mixing in the smetana and salt and the dill. And initially, it's a way for him to be distracted from having to tell the journalist the story that is quite hard for him to unlock. And then it becomes something that they share, and eventually he invites her to eat with him. And I just thought it would be a lovely thing to invite the audience to taste some of the salad that they've smelt and watched for an hour and a half. But also, really importantly, the other thing I want to do with the salad is to think about bringing the audience in and just breaking that fourth wall to invite people in. It's like an act of generosity, but it becomes our responsibility as an audience to do something about the problem.
Well, it almost puts the audience in the place of the journalist who's come to this man's home to listen to him and to gather his testimony. It's like, now you have shared the salad, you are part of the witness.
Well, I definitely was thinking a lot about that Elie Wiesel's sense of bearing witness through this show, that we are the journalist, absolutely, and hearing those stories and helping our our survivors to be heard.
I'll come back to that, but not to make this whole interview about the journalism. But I was interested in the character of the journalist who comes and interview the security man on two accounts. One, because, and I don't know whether that's fictionalized or not, including her own story of the beginning of the war as a way to give something of herself, unlock this man's memories, but also for her to process it. I thought that was very interesting. So I was wondering how you came to include that.
So it's part of the research that Anastasia and I did. Was we spoke to the journalists who work for the Reckoning Project and the Public Interest Journalism Lab and learned a little bit about how they gather testimonies, how they listen, what questions they ask, how they don't re-traumatize the survivors and the witnesses as they listen to their stories. And, one of the journalists, Natalia Dominic, talked a lot about how she just listens. She sits and she cries when her subjects cry, and she's just there for hours. It's not a normal kind of journey. It's not like yours and my 15-minute interview. It's like the hours they're there with each other. And I did ask a lawyer in Berlin when I was doing the research. I said, why is it that these testimonies are so extraordinary? I mean, yes, I can see you're getting the facts you need for the courts, like how many chevrons there are on the jacket and what tanks there were or what the call sign name was. I can see it's in there, but also there are these reflections on the nature of humanity, how these sort of small acts of kindness that aren't going to end up in court. And this guy, the lawyer, said to me, he said, yeah, that's why we work with the journalists, because they create the empathy and they create the connection, which ensures that these stories come out. And I thought, wow, I need to have that in my show. So I then spoke to the journalist who'd interviewed our man from Stoyanka, and she talked a little bit about how she'd been affected by the experience of listening to all these testimonies. And so that thing that at the end of our play, the journalist talks a little bit about needing to step back because she sees all the memories of all the people that she's ever interviewed. And that was, obviously that's a really significant part of our story, but that comes directly from this journalist who we credit in the show, and she's coming to see our last performance, I'm thrilled to say. But it's really her story that we're bringing to life. And I actually, a couple of years ago, I did a project on Holocaust trauma. There's a woman called Dr. Marianne Hirsch who has something called post-memory. And in post-memory that she identified as a phenomenon, she herself is a daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she talked about being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor where your parents' memories are so huge that you don't have enough space for your own memories. Their memories become yours. So I was thinking about the equivalent with this, what it is to be a journalist covering this war, to have everybody's stories in your head and no longer have the space for your own. So I guess I was exploring that through the show.
Yeah, it's really well done, because the concept of vicarious trauma as war journalists is something that's much more talked about recently, but it's still taboo in the profession, mostly because we haven't lived through war. We're not really allowed by ourselves to hold that trauma. And so when it happens, I think it's something that's very confusing. How can you experience that secondhand almost? I have a couple of other questions. At the end of the play, you show the real faces of the characters whose testimony you put on the stage and their names. Have you had any contact with them? Do you know what's happened to them since? I really enjoyed the fact that it was individualized like that and didn't stay in the cloud of whether that's fiction or fact for the audience.
Yes, obviously they all gave us permission to use their stories in the show and show their pictures on stage. I did keep the actors quite far away from them. In fact, the first time they ever saw their pictures was only just before we opened the show, because I just didn't want them to spend their whole time trying to be that person, as opposed to being an actor encountering that person, which is what's so joyous about this show, is that you get to see an actor playing and exploring and becoming somebody else, you see. But I have subsequently had the lowdown on some of them, because Natalia Kremenchuk came for our press night and she told us that, for example, our security guard no longer works as a security guard for that house because he's had to step back because his spine is in too much pain from having been beaten by the Russians, which I didn't know. So there are those stories that I've had as coders to our play.
There's one sentence in the play that really struck me towards the end, when the security guard and the journalist are reckoning with what it's like to have all of that trauma stored in your head in all of these stories, and what's your responsibility towards that. And I think she says it's about understanding the value of their own lives. And I thought that was really powerful in a way to come out of again, the cloud of trauma and the cloud of dark stories that these characters encounter. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that phrase.
I think that text did come verbatim from the journalist when she was telling us about how she'd been seeing a psychologist.
All right, it's the psychologist who tells her that.
Yeah, so it's really lovely that you identify that as something, because that really, they're at the heart of the piece. So it does feel like an important thing to keep. And it is a moment in our play, the way that it lands, it's a moment that they can share. There's so much they can't share. She left, he stayed. He lived with Russians. He carries this deep trauma and guilt of people that he didn't save. And she has an immense guilt, and they don't connect. And in that moment they do, and they both have that recognition of the value of their lives and each other's lives. It's a love affair without there being a love affair, if that makes sense, that moment.
Yeah, it's also a way to come out of survivor's guilt in a way.
Yeah, exactly that.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked?
There is something I didn't say, which is every night of our show we have a different real guest, a guest who comes and offers a reflection on the show from the prism of their lived experience as journalists, as lawyers, as activists, as humanitarian aid drivers. And it's a way for us to ease our audiences out back into the real world and give them something that they can do.
Josephine, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Simeon Kylsyi, and I'm an actor, and in this play I'm playing myself, because I'm sharing partly my personal stories and experience, but also I'm playing witnesses in this show, and I'm playing mother, witness, and the priest.
So tell me how you got involved into that play.
I got an invitation from Josephine, director of the show, to come for casting because she saw my another production and she invited me to participate. And I understood that, I want to work on this show.
So in the play, you talk a little bit about your own personal story of the war and also how you came to be an actor. But you also, as you said, embody two different testimonies and witnesses, the mother and the priest. How is it different playing a character that's been written for fiction and embodying one of your countrymen and women on something that they have lived through and that is still very much ongoing and that probably resonates, I would imagine, with some of your experience of the invasion?
Yeah, exactly. When you play in some fictional play a character, you need to find your way how to connect with the story and find this inner response to the fictional story. But with real testimonies, there's no need to find a connection. You really connected to it from the very beginning because I know these people and we all going through this war. And of course, everyone has the individual experience of it. And Josephine didn't give us to listen these interviews and they didn't show us the pictures. And it was a very smart decision because I just read the text, I read the testimonies, and it was so easy for me to connect to this story and embody the character. And that even when I saw the pictures in the first run, finally, how these people look like, I understood I don't want to change anything because I imagine them. They look like this and this is my people.
Why is it important to bring these testimonies and these witness statements so freshly as well? Like, the war is still ongoing, so it's not like history has happened and we can look back on what happened and process. It's very immediate. What does it mean to you to be doing that work as an actor while the war is happening?
First of all, I feel privileged to be able to speak, to bring these stories in life, to share it with audience now at this moment. I feel my personal responsibility that I need to do it. And it's very important in this moment to say to people, it's still happening and we need support now even more than in the beginning of war, because now the situation is very hard for us. And I believe in the power of theater that when people who come to see the play, they really can connect suddenly, not just by pictures on the TV, they can connect with the human, they can feel us, they can smell our salad. And I believe that they can ask themselves what I can do in this moment. Because as we say in our show, that it's not about standing together for Ukraine, because I believe you have to find your own way to stand for Ukraine individually. And then when everyone finds this inner fire just to say, okay, I can do this, or I can do this, or I can just spread the information, this will bring this togetherness, this unity, and then it will work. So freedom it's the action. You have to step for peace, not just to speak for it.
These testimonies that are in the play, they're originally intended for prosecutors' offices in order to build legal cases. And they find another avenue to reach a different audience in theatre. Would you say that's complementary? What does theatre add on top of what the prosecutors do in terms of the value of these testimonies and their role in society?
I would say that what theatre have to do, it's just to bring questions to the audience and to put the gaze in the topics which is very important to look at this moment. But the power also of theatre and art, it's just to see the humans behind the numbers. It's become very hard to imagine even how many people went through such a horrible experience of war crimes from Russia. And this is our task, just to say, behind each number, as they said, they had 6,000 witnesses, and we just show 5 of them. And I believe that we can say behind each number, there is a human with his life, with his story, and we need to find justice.
I'll finish with a question that I ask everyone from Ukraine that I meet and that I interview for this show, and you've led perfectly into it. What does justice look like for you?
For me, as a citizen, justice is look like that everyone who did all these crimes, they will be in the court, and that world will show that aggressor have to be punished. For me, as a human side, I know that it's very hard to bring all these people to the court, but I believe in the justice in the way that we are fighting for good thing. We're fighting for ourselves, for our choice, for our freedom. And this means that in the end, we will find a way out from such a hard situation we are now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Reckoning is at the Arcola Theatre in London until the 28th of June. The team hope to tour the UK and the US after that. So if you're involved in the theatre world and want to learn more or assist, you'll find a link in the show notes to contact them. Let's turn to final thoughts now. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners?
Thanks, Francis. I want to leave our listeners in the sea, the snot green sea, the scrotum tightening sea. Happy Bloomsday to all our friends in Ireland. Bloomsday being the annual celebration of the life and works of Irish writer James Joyce, marked on June the 16th, as on that day is set his 1922 novel Ulysses, which charts the meanderings, both physical and philosophical, of his central character Leopold Bloom. Now, I have many times enjoyed plunging into the snot green sea off Sandy Cove in Dunleary, just south of Dublin, which features early on in the book, and can attest to its scrotum tightening properties. I have then rather hastily retreated to Fitzgerald's bar nearby for a restorative pint. Anyway, the book's set at the turn of the last century, and many people mark Bloomsday each year by dressing up in Edwardian clothes. So, speaking as someone who works with you daily, Francis, what?
Now, go on.
It feels to me in many ways that every day is Bloomsday. Anyway, happy Bloomsday to all our listeners, whether dressed like Francis or not. That's what I was going to say. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, I'm not even wearing a tie today. It's bad, isn't it? I mean, I think it's just because it's so warm outside. But I'll bring back the sartorial elegance another time. He's actually brought in Ulysses. He's got it on the table right now. Look at that. It's a. Did you buy that specially just so you could show off?
I've never read that. I've never actually owned the book.
Right. Oh, well, you're in for a treat. Let's put it that way. I've suffered my way through that when I was at university.
You could feel my breasts all perfume, yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said yes.
Yeah, stop that. That's quite enough of this. Anyway, can we bring it back to the subject at hand? As those of you subscribed to our free weekly newsletter will know, there was considerable reaction to the interview with historian Professor Vladislav Zubok, which ran last Monday. And I wanted to read a slightly shortened example of that reaction, which summed up many critiques made by you. It's by Dr. Julia Murawska, visiting senior research fellow at King's College London. She writes, "There are several aspects to which I could critique. For example, the portrayal of Gorbachev as a self-sacrificing liberator of Eastern Europe. But I wanted to focus on just one, namely Zubok's characterization of the diplomatic process in the Russia-Ukrainian war. Firstly, I find his assertion that there is a pervasive disregard of diplomatic measures to end the war on the part of the West divorced from reality. Both Ukraine and its NATO Western supporters have demonstrated initiative multiple times on the diplomatic front by offering and organising talks, submitting workable negotiating positions, and proposing a succession of ceasefires to the Russian Federation, all of which the latter systematically ignored. The Kremlin has not changed its maximalist aim of subjugating and controlling all of Ukraine by means of a military defeat. Secondly, Zubok lambasts the West's and Ukraine's insistence that a ceasefire be a prerequisite to serious peace talks. He characterises this insistence as a detriment to diplomacy and criticises it for not being aligned with the lessons of the Cold War era. But the alternative position is for the Russian military to continue its illegal and unprovoked invasion of sovereign Ukraine and its relentless bombardment of Ukrainian homes, schools and hospitals, while the Russian negotiating delegation questions Ukraine's sovereignty and legitimacy as a nation-state without any credible or constructive negotiating positions. Finally, I find Zubok's premise that the Cold War era has some kind of objective, clear-cut lessons for the current war, if only they could be discovered by clever academics and communicated to blinkered policymakers, unpersuasive. The bipolar stability of the Cold War was underpinned by the prevalence and normative acceptance of spheres of influence as a means of organising the international system. The Cold War confrontation was stable in the Euro-Atlantic context because Ukraine, amongst others, was part of the USSR, yes, but also a part of the Russian sphere of influence. Neither of these conditions holds true today. Not only does Ukraine refuse to be tethered to the Russian sphere of influence, it insists on its sovereign right to chart its own future and defence policy, and to choose its own alliances, military or otherwise. The reason that Ukraine, like other post-Soviet states, is able to hold this position, and the reason why it is legitimate for it to do so, is because our current international system is based on the principle of self-determination, where sovereign nation-states are free in their choice of alliances and geopolitical orientation. Yes, this system is still assailed by vestiges of the Cold War spheres of influence approach. Indeed, it was a major driver of Russia's invasion. But it is nevertheless enshrined in the fundament of international institutions and alliances like NATO. No amount of contrived Cold War-era wisdom will negate the powerful forces that have been unleashed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Should you choose to read my email on air, please feel free to use my full name. Your listeners should know that confident pronouncements of academics do not necessarily stand up to scrutiny. Well, thank you very much, Julia, and to everyone who wrote in after that interview, whether in agreement or disagreement with the arguments that were made. We welcome them all. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.